If I ask you to describe New Zealand, you'd probably say mountains, peaceful scenery, maybe the Lord of the Rings. A quiet, idyllic nation, right? It's the ultimate postcard destination. But what if I told you that behind that serene image, back in 1984, this small country conducted the most radical, aggressive, free market experiment in the entire democratic world? In a single afternoon, a minister of finance basically hit the reset button on his country's economy, ignoring the traditional path that every other developed nation was following. It was faster, it was bolder, and in many ways, more radical than what happened under Thatcher in the UK or Reagan in the US. So, how did a sheep farming nation pull off an economic revolution that still influences central banks around the world today? And why does almost no one talk about it? Let's deconstruct the New Zealand experiment. To understand why Roger Douglas felt he had no choice but to push the reset button in 1984, we have to look at what New Zealand was before. For decades, this wasn't just a quiet nation, it was an economic powerhouse. By 1950, New Zealanders enjoyed one of the highest standards of living on the entire planet. And the secret? It was almost shockingly simple. Wool, meat, and butter. New Zealand had a guaranteed, lucrative buyer for everything it could produce, Great Britain. But in 1973, everything changed. Britain joined the European Economic Community and decided to buy its food from Europe instead. Just like that, New Zealand's guaranteed customer vanished overnight. This wasn't just a minor trade hiccup, it was an existential crisis for the nation's entire welfare state. So, what did the government do? Instead of pivoting, they tried to freeze time. They poured massive subsidies into farming to keep production up. They built enormous tariff walls to protect local manufacturers. And perhaps most surprisingly, they imposed extreme controls on the economy, controlling wages, prices, interest rates, and even exactly how much foreign currency a citizen could take out of the country. They created one of the most tightly controlled economies outside of the communist bloc. But here's the lesson that history teaches us. You cannot manage your way out of a changing world by simply banning the changes. By 1984, the results were disastrous. The government was freezing wages and prices by decree, borrowing recklessly to fund state industrial projects that simply weren't working. And yet, the ship was still sinking. Inflation had skyrocketed to 17%, and the country had slipped from 6th to 19th in global income. By the time the snap election in July 1984 rolled around, the Treasury didn't just say the economy was struggling, they said it was close to bankruptcy. Money was actively fleeing the country. New Zealand was cornered. And that, my friends, is why the radical 1984 budget wasn't just a political choice. It was a desperate reaction to a decade of refusing to accept that the world had moved on. So if the government's big idea was to freeze time, Roger Douglas walked in and did the exact opposite. He slammed the whole thing into fast forward. The program he launched picked up a nickname, Rogernomics, a deliberate play on Reaganomics. But the name is the least interesting thing about it. What actually matters is the speed. Because the way Douglas moved is the thing economists and governments would study and argue over for the next 40 years. Miss the speed, and you miss the entire strategy. Let me take you inside that single afternoon, November 8th, 1984. Douglas stands up in Parliament to read his very first budget. A few minutes in, the room goes silent, and then it gasps. Because in one line, he had just wiped out around $1 billion a year of support for the country's farmers. There was no phase out and no decade of gentle transition to cushion it. The support was simply gone that same afternoon. For a nation whose whole identity was built on farming, this was a bit like a farmer setting fire to his own barn and calling it a fresh start. And here's the genuinely wild part. He did it fast on purpose. Douglas even wrote his strategy down. Define your objectives clearly, he said, and move towards them in quantum leaps. Otherwise, the interest groups will have time to mobilize and drag you down. Translation? Move so fast on so many fronts at once that nobody can organize to block any single piece of it. The speed was the whole weapon. So the changes came like a flood. The dollar was floated and instantly devalued by 20%. Foreign exchange controls? Gone. Farm subsidies? Gone. The tariff walls protecting local industry were torn down. Wage and price controls? Scrapped. A brand new goods and services tax? Introduced. The top income tax rate? Slashed from nearly 60% down to 33%. And the great state-owned giants, the post office, the airline, the railways, the steelworks, were turned into businesses, and many of them sold off entirely. But let's be honest about what that flood did to actual human beings. Tearing down those tariff walls threw local manufacturers into a global boxing ring they had never trained for, and thousands of factory jobs simply evaporated. Entire towns lost their reason to exist. Unemployment, which had basically been a rounding error, exploded into double digits. A whole generation raised on the promise of a job for life watched that promise disappear. And here's the uncomfortable truth buried in the success story. The reforms would eventually get the credit for saving the economy. But the people who paid the price and the people who collected the reward were so often not the same people. That wound still shapes New Zealand's politics today, 4 decades on. Now, of all the dominoes Douglas knocked over, one still stands out as the most reckless and the most fascinating, because no other developed country has been willing to copy it, even now, 40 years on. He didn't just trim farm support, he took basically all of it away, in a country where farming was the entire economic foundation. So this was the single biggest gamble in the whole experiment. And what happened next? It genuinely surprised me, and it holds the single most important lesson in this story for every rich country still fighting about subsidies right now. If you're getting something out of this, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it means the next one of these just finds you automatically. Anyway, before 1984, New Zealand's farmers were among the most heavily subsidized on the entire planet. Then, over about 3 years, that safety net was cut away to almost nothing. And in the short term, it was ugly. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Farm incomes collapsed. Land prices got sliced in half. Families who'd worked the same soil for generations were suddenly staring down the barrel of ruin. And rural New Zealand went through a genuine wave of pain. Foreclosures, forced sales, the kind of quiet devastation older farmers still talk about with a lump in their throat. And look, I really wanted to hand you a hard number here. Exactly how many families lost their farms in those years? So I went digging, and I couldn't find a figure the sources actually agree on. The estimates are all over the map, wide enough that I won't insult you by slapping a fake precise number on screen and pretending it's gospel. But here's what nobody disputes. The pain was real, it was concentrated, and it landed almost entirely on people who'd done nothing wrong, except build their lives around a system their own government switched off overnight. But then comes the twist nobody saw coming. The farmers who survived, they adapted. They did the exact thing the government had spent a decade refusing to do. Freed from subsidies that had been quietly paying them to overproduce the wrong things, they started chasing what the world actually wanted to buy. Sheep farmers pivoted into dairy, into deer, into wine, into kiwi fruit. And within a decade, New Zealand agriculture was leaner, smarter, more diverse, and far more globally competitive than it had ever been while it was protected. Fast forward to today, and here's the punchline. New Zealand's farmers now receive some of the lowest government support in the entire developed world, a tiny fraction of what farmers in the EU, the US, or Japan collect. And they are still among the most efficient anywhere on Earth. A country of barely 5 million people produces around 3% of the world's dairy, and a single co-op, Fonterra, stands among the biggest dairy exporters on the planet. Which leaves us with a genuinely uncomfortable lesson. Sometimes the very support you're fighting hardest to protect is the exact thing holding you back. Okay, so the reforms hauled New Zealand back from the edge of the cliff, but they left one massive problem still unsolved, and the way this tiny country cracked it became its most important and least appreciated gift to the entire world. That problem? Inflation. And the fix a small central bank dreamed up down in Wellington is, at this very moment, quietly running inside the institution that sets your interest rates, wherever on earth you happen to be watching this. This is the part of the story that reaches straight into your wallet. By the late 1980s, New Zealand had wrestled inflation down from 17%. But nobody trusted it to stay there. And for decades, politicians everywhere had been running the same rigged little game. Slash interest rates right before an election so everyone feels rich, then let the next guy clean up the inflation. Central banks mostly did whatever the politicians of the day told them to. So in 1989, New Zealand tried something no country had ever dared. It passed a law, the Reserve Bank Act, handing its central bank one single, legally binding mission: keep inflation inside a specific target number and stay completely out of politics. The first target? 0 to 2%. The government picks the number, but the governor of the central bank gets total freedom and total personal responsibility to actually hit it. Miss? You could lose your job. The man handed that mission was Don Brash. His deadline? Get inflation into that 0 to 2% band by the end of 1992. He did it a full year early, in December 1991. And look, the cost was real. Tight money drove unemployment up sharply while it did its work, but it held. Inflation, the ghost that had haunted New Zealand for a whole generation, was finally caged. And more importantly, it stayed caged. Now here's why this should matter to you specifically, no matter where you live. Before New Zealand, central banks basically never announced a hard inflation number and then staked their entire reputation on hitting it. But after little New Zealand proved it actually worked, everyone copied it. The Bank of England adopted an inflation target in 1992, 3 years behind New Zealand. Canada, Sweden, Australia, and eventually dozens more fell into line. The European Central Bank and the US Federal Reserve both run explicit inflation goals today. So if you've got a mortgage in the UK, the reason your monthly repayment climbs or drops is that the Bank of England is chasing a 2% inflation target, a system first written into law by a country most of the world mentally files under sheep. Just sit with that for a second, my friends. A country of a few million people, tucked away at the absolute bottom of the map, quietly built the operating system that now runs monetary policy across most of the developed world. And it's not even a one-off. The Phillips curve, one of the most famous ideas in all of economics, taught in literally every first-year course on the planet, is named after Bill Phillips, also a New Zealander. For such a small, remote country, New Zealand has produced a jaw-droppingly outsized share of the ideas that secretly govern how money works. And that is the quiet brilliance those sheep jokes have been hiding all along. So that's the happy ending, right? New Zealand rescued its economy, gifted the world its greatest economic idea, and now it gets to sit back as a wealthy, stable, admired little country. Except, that's not quite where the story ends. And honestly, the part that usually gets left out might be the most important part of all. Because the country that solved everyone else's problems is sitting on a stubborn little pile of problems it still can't solve for itself. Stop here at Quiet Genius, and you walk away with a comforting fairy tale instead of the truth. Let's start with productivity. For all the deregulation, all the openness, all the reform, New Zealanders work long hours and produce surprisingly little for each one of them. Their labor productivity sits stubbornly below the top half of wealthy nations, and that gap has barely moved in decades. Picture a country sprinting flat out on a treadmill. Enormous effort, almost no forward motion. Now, the story you'll usually hear is that the 1980s reforms turned New Zealand into a clean, shining, free market success story. And I've got to be honest with you, I think that reading is way too generous, and the productivity numbers are exactly why. Yes, the reforms genuinely rescued a country that was sprinting toward a cliff, and I'll never take that away from them. But rescued from collapse and actually thriving are two completely different destinations, and New Zealand has spent 40 years stranded somewhere in between. The reforms fixed the emergency. What they never delivered was the lasting, broad-based prosperity the true believers promised. And glossing over that quietly erases the millions of ordinary New Zealanders who did all the extra work and never got the extra reward. Then there's housing. New Zealand now has some of the least affordable housing in the entire developed world relative to what people actually earn. In the big cities, Auckland above all, prices have rocketed to levels that basically lock an entire generation out of ever owning a home. That very same openness that rolled out the red carpet for global capital also helped inflate one of the most dangerously stretched property markets anywhere on Earth. And the economy is still worryingly concentrated. Remember that brilliant adaptation we just celebrated? It has limits. New Zealand leans heavily on selling dairy to one dominant customer. China now buys roughly a quarter of everything it exports. And tourism, its other great earner at around 6% of the economy, vanished into thin air the instant the borders slammed shut in the pandemic. For a country that prides itself on being economically clever, it stays startlingly exposed to two very fragile things: the global price of milk powder and whether foreigners feel like getting on a plane. None of this erases what New Zealand pulled off. It just complicates the postcard. This is a country brilliant enough to invent the framework that tames inflation across the globe, yet somehow unable to build enough houses for its own children or lift its own workers up to match its neighbors. The quiet brilliance is absolutely real, but so are the quiet failures. And holding both of those truths in your head at the exact same time, that's the only honest way to understand this place. Roger Douglas is in his late 80s now, and depending entirely on who you ask, he is either the man who saved New Zealand or the man who bulldozed a gentler version of it that never came back. People still fight about this, fiercely, and honestly, I don't think that fight ever gets fully settled, because both sides are pointing at something completely, undeniably real. So here's where I land after all of it. Strip away the ideology, and New Zealand's story is really the story of a small country that got backed into a corner and then made genuinely radical choices. Some of them worked so well they spread across the entire planet. Others left scars you can still see from orbit. The inflation targeting system it invented is protecting the value of the money in your pocket at this very moment. The subsidy experiment it ran is a lesson every farming nation is still stubbornly refusing to learn. And the housing and productivity problems it can't crack are a warning to the rest of us. Being clever about economics is simply not the same thing as being comfortable. And that, my friends, is what the postcard leaves out. New Zealand is one of the most fascinating economic laboratories on the entire planet. A place that keeps running the bold experiments the rest of us are too scared to even attempt, and then lives with the consequences right out in the open for the whole world to see. The brilliance really is quiet, but now that you know exactly where to look, you will never be able to unsee it. So New Zealand proves what a tiny, remote country can pull off when it's forced to get clever, punching so far above its weight that its ideas end up quietly running the world's central banks. But if you want to see small country absolutely staggering wealth pushed to the total extreme, you have to fly to the complete opposite side of the planet, to a country so small you could drive clean across it in about 20 minutes. It has no army, no airport, a population smaller than a mid-sized town, and yet it holds the highest GDP per person of any country on Earth, richer per head than Luxembourg, than Switzerland, than the entire United States. It has more registered companies than it has actual citizens. And back in 2002, one lone data entry clerk walked out of a bank there with 4 DVDs tucked in his bag, discs that would go on to trigger the single biggest tax evasion investigation in German history. That video breaks down exactly how 38,000 people built the richest economy per head on the planet, what that money is really doing there, why a full third of that wealth has nothing to do with banking at all, and how one man's stolen discs nearly brought the entire system crashing down. It's on this channel right now. Go watch it.